Have you ever thought about the impact of European ideologies, specifically fascism and Nazism, on India, a country thousands of miles away? Well, it's indeed a fascinating subject to delve into, as both these ideologies have left indelible imprints on the world, and India is no exception. Now let's set the stage by understanding what these ideologies are and the leaders who championed them. Fascism was an authoritarian political movement that emerged in Italy in the early 20th century. This ideology was synonymous with the name Benito Mussolini, who ruled Italy with an iron fist from the early 1920s until the end of the Second World War. The fascist regime under Mussolini was characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. Simultaneously, a similar ideology was taking root in Germany. Nazism, a form of fascism, espoused German racial purity and superiority. This ideology led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, a man whose name is etched in history for the catastrophic events of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany was transformed into a totalitarian state where nearly all aspects of life were controlled by the government. These ideologies, though born in Europe, had far-reaching implications that touched every corner of the world. They led to a global conflict that resulted in the death of millions and changed the course of history. But how did these ideologies influence a country as distant as India, which was under British colonial rule at the time? Well, the echoes of fascism and Nazism traveled far and wide, influencing political thought and movements even in countries not directly involved in the conflict. In India, these ideologies sparked a range of reactions and responses, from outright condemnation to subtle influences on the freedom movement. Now that we have a basic understanding of these ideologies, let's examine their influence on India. In the next scenes, we will explore India's perspective and response to these ideologies and their impact on the nation's struggle for freedom. So, stay tuned as we uncover the intriguing connection between fascism, Nazism, and India. As fascism and Nazism took root in Europe, how did far-off India perceive them? This is a question that intrigues many, and the answer is as complex as the Indian subcontinent itself. To understand India's initial reactions, we need to take a step back and look at the Indian political and social context of the 1920s and 1930s. During this time, India was under British colonial rule. The Indian National Congress, the leading political party, had been advocating for self-rule, and the people were yearning for freedom. Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, with their strong nationalist rhetoric, may have seemed appealing to some Indians dissatisfied with British rule. The idea of a powerful state that could stand up to imperial powers had its allure. But it's important to remember that these ideologies were also deeply authoritarian and racist, concepts that were starkly at odds with India's diverse and pluralistic society. Prominent Indian leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru were vocal critics of both fascism and Nazism. Nehru in particular was deeply influenced by socialist ideals and saw the rise of these ideologies as a threat to global peace. He warned that fascism and Nazism were not just European problems, but global ones that could potentially disrupt the world order. However, not all Indian political leaders shared this view. Some, like Subhash Chandra Bose, saw potential allies in the Axis powers in their fight against British colonial rule. This led to the formation of the Indian National Army with Japanese support, a controversial episode in India's struggle for independence. But let's not forget the common people. For them, fascism and Nazism were distant ideologies, far removed from their daily struggles under British rule. Their immediate concern was freedom from colonial rule, and their understanding of these European ideologies was often filtered through this lens. As we can see, India's initial response was complex, shaped by its own political and social realities. It's a fascinating chapter in the history of India's struggle for independence, one that reveals the many nuances of this period. But did these ideologies have any direct impact on India's struggle for freedom? You might wonder. Let's delve into that. Fascism and Nazism, as ideologies, were far removed from the ideals of democracy and freedom that India was fighting for. Yet they had a profound impact on the course of India's freedom movement. The rise of these authoritarian regimes in Europe sparked varied reactions amongst Indian leaders. Some leaders like Subhas Chandra Bose saw strategic opportunities in the enemy of my enemy is my friend principle. Bose sought help from Germany and Japan, hoping that their enmity with Britain would translate into support for India's freedom struggle. He formed the Free India Legion and later the Indian National Army in collaboration with these Axis powers. On the other hand, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru vehemently opposed the ideologies of fascism and Nazism. They believed that aligning with such regimes would compromise the very principles of freedom and democracy that they were fighting for. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence was in stark contrast to the aggressive militarism of fascism and Nazism. The reactions of Indian leaders to fascism and Nazism were not merely ideological. They were also strategic. The Second World War had weakened Britain, and Indian leaders seized this opportunity to intensify their freedom struggle. The Quit India movement of 1942 is a prime example of this strategic response. In essence, fascism and Nazism indirectly influenced the Indian freedom movement. They shaped the strategies adopted by Indian leaders and intensified the struggle for freedom. These ideologies also highlighted the contrast between the principles of freedom and democracy that India was fighting for and the authoritarian regimes of Europe. Clearly, the impact of fascism and Nazism was not just confined to Europe. It reached the shores of India and played a part in its struggle for freedom. So, the next time you delve into the pages of history, remember that the ripples of these ideologies were felt far and wide, transcending geographical boundaries. While some Indians resisted these ideologies, others found in them a common enemy of British imperialism. How did this dichotomy play out? As the winds of fascism and Nazism blew across Europe, they stirred up a storm of diverse reactions in India. This was a time of political ferment, with the country's struggle for independence reaching a fever pitch. The ideologies of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany were viewed through the lens of this struggle, leading to a variety of responses. On one hand, there was strong resistance against these ideologies. Many Indians influenced by the principles of democracy, pluralism, and human rights saw fascism and Nazism as a threat to these values. They were horrified by the racial discrimination, authoritarian rule, and aggressive militarism that characterized these ideologies. Prominent figures like Rabindranath Tagore and Jawaharlal Nehru voiced their opposition, warning of the dangers of following such a path. However, on the other hand, there were those who found some common ground with these ideologies. They saw in them a powerful challenge to British imperialism, a force that they too were fighting against. Figures like Subhas Chandra Bose believed that the enemy of their enemy could be their friend and sought to align with these powers to expedite India's freedom struggle. They viewed fascism and Nazism as a means to an end, a tool to hasten the end of colonial rule. This dichotomy was not just a reflection of the political diversity in India, but also a testament to the complex dynamics of the time. The question of whether to resist or support these foreign ideologies became entangled with the larger question of how to achieve independence. It sparked intense debates and discussions, shaping the contours of India's freedom movement. And so, the Indian response to fascism and Nazism was far from a monolith. It ranged from outright resistance to pragmatic support, from moral outrage to strategic alliance. It was a mirror to the diverse and complex society that India was and continues to be. As we have seen, the Indian response to fascism and Nazism was far from uniform, reflecting the diversity and complexity of Indian society. So, what can we conclude about the impact of fascism and Nazism on India? A loaded question indeed. As we've explored in this journey, the reach of these ideologies extended far beyond the borders of Italy and Germany, influencing the thoughts and actions of individuals and organizations in India. Fascism and Nazism, although rooted in Europe, had a significant impact on India's struggle for independence. They fueled debates and discussions within the Indian National Congress, the primary force behind India's independence movement. Some leaders were inspired by the nationalistic fervor of these ideologies, while others were repelled by their authoritarian and exclusionary nature. The rise of fascism and Nazism also had far-reaching implications for India's international relations. The British Empire, which was ruling India at the time, was an ally of Italy and Germany during the early stages of World War II. This alliance complicated India's stance towards these ideologies, leading to some intriguing diplomatic maneuvers. Furthermore, the ideologies of fascism and Nazism influenced some Indian leaders and thinkers who admired the nationalistic fervor they embodied. These ideologies, however, were not without their critics in India. Many Indian intellectuals and leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, expressed their disdain for the authoritarian and exclusionary nature of these ideologies. Fascism and Nazism also left a mark on India's political landscape. The legacy of these ideologies can still be observed in the form of debates on nationalism, secularism, and the role of the state in society. These debates continue to shape India's political discourse, demonstrating the lasting influence of fascism and Nazism. So to answer the initial question, the impact of fascism and Nazism on India was profound. These ideologies influenced India's struggle for independence, its international relations, and its political discourse. Despite the geographical distance, the influence of fascism and Nazism on India was profound, shaping its political landscape in ways that continue to resonate.